What would you do if a simple mistake, dialing the wrong number, ended up saving your mother's life and changing yours forever? When young Sophie calls for help, she never expects a billionaire to answer, but Daman Ward's timely arrival sparks a chain of events that neither her nor her mother could have imagined. Before we dive in, hit the subscribe button and tell us where in the world you're watching from. It started with the sound of porcelain shattering. Then came silence. In the small apartment above a shuttered hardware store in East Boston, 7-year-old Sophie Ruiz stood frozen at the doorway to the kitchen. Her mother lay on the floor, motionless. One arm sprawled across a spilled cup of chamomile tea. Steam still rose from the broken mug. Elena's head struck the cabinet on the way down. Blood now traced a thin line behind her ear. Sophie dropped her stuffed koala and stepped forward on trembling legs. "Mom." No answer. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She did what her mother told her to do if anything ever went wrong. Call Uncle Ryan. She climbed onto the counter, grabbed her mother's phone, and opened the contacts list. Her fingers were cold. She misdialed just one number off. The call connected. A man's voice came through, calm and low. Sophie hesitated. "Sorry, is this Ryan?" "No, I need help. My mom fell. She's bleeding. She's not waking up." Then static. Daman Ward stood in the dark, barefoot on the polished concrete of his penthouse, phone still to his ear. The city glittered through the glass behind him, indifferent and distant. "Where are you?" he asked. The little voice hesitated. "I don't know the street, but we live above Jimmy's Tools. There's a red door. Apartment 3B. That was enough." Damien didn't ask more. He didn't tell his assistant, didn't call an ambulance. He threw on a coat and grabbed the keys. 13 minutes later, the black SUV tore down a frozen back street and screeched to a stop. The building was what the city called historic, which really meant neglected. A red door, barely hanging on its hinges, stood at the top of 3 concrete steps, crusted with old ice. He took them 2 at a time. The hallway smelled like dust and old radiator steam. Apartment 3B had the door open just an inch. Daman knocked once. The door creaked wider. A small girl stood in the narrow gap, her socks soaked, clutching the edge of her mother's phone like it was a shield. "You came," she said. "I did." She stepped back. Daman entered without asking. The apartment was neat but worn. A pile of laundry in the corner, soup still warming on the stove, a calendar on the fridge with 3 dates circled in red. He knelt beside Alina. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. He checked her pulse, pressed gently on her ribs. Concussion. Maybe more. She needed help now. He scooped her up in his arms without hesitation. She was light, too light for someone who probably skipped meals so her daughter wouldn't. "Coat," he said gently to Sophie. She grabbed her jacket and followed him. Out. The SUV roared to life. He blasted into the cabin as Sophie climbed into the back beside her mother. Damien drove with one hand, already calculating the nearest emergency entrance with the shortest wait time. At the second red light, Sophie spoke. "You're not Ryan?" "No." "Are you a doctor?" "No." She thought about that, then said softly, "You came anyway." Daman didn't answer. He glanced in the mirror. She was watching him, not with fear, with something else. Hope. He turned back to the road. "She's going to be okay. You promise?" "I do." He didn't know why he said that, but in that moment, it was the only thing that felt true. At the ER entrance, Daman didn't wait for a nurse. He carried Alina straight inside, past the check-in desk, past the protests of a night clerk, and directly to the trauma bay. "I'm not leaving her in the hallway," he said simply. He didn't argue again. While doctors worked on stabilizing Alina, Daman sat in the waiting area with Sophie. She curled up on the bench beside him, her jacket still zipped up to her chin. He handed her a warm bottle of water. She held it without drinking. "Is she your mom?" he asked. She nodded. "She works a lot." Damien glanced at the vending machine, then back to Sophie. "You hungry?" She shook her head. "She'd want me to stay right here." He didn't press her. Half an hour later, a nurse came out. Alina was stable. Concussion. dehydration, exhaustion, no internal bleeding. She'll wake up soon, the nurse said. You can go see her. Sophie looked at Damien. Will you come too? Paused, then nodded. Lena blinked, her throat dry, her body stiff like she'd been asleep too long in the wrong position. A dull pain bloomed in her left temple. She turned her head, wincing, and saw a man sitting quietly in the corner of the hospital room. Not a doctor, not anyone she recognized. She sat up too fast. The four in her hand tugged. The man stood. His voice was low, but calm. Careful. You lost a lot of blood. Alina stared at him. Who? Who are you? There was a long pause before he replied. I got a phone call from your daughter. She said you fell. I was the one who brought you here. Her lips parted. Wait, Sophie called. The memory hit her like a jolt. The kitchen floor, her knees buckling, the cold tiles, then blackness. She closed her eyes. God, I must have told her to call Ryan. He lives 2 floors down. She must have dialed the wrong number. He nodded once. She was scared, but she did exactly what she had to do. Lena opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked down at the 4 line, her breathing still shaky. Then, she said it quietly but clearly. Thank you for coming, for helping her, helping me. The man didn't nod or smile, but something shifted in his posture. A slight loosening of his shoulders, like a weight had been acknowledged. She said you were bleeding. I didn't think twice, he said. I just drove. She looked up at him. Didn't call an ambulance. I didn't have time to wait. I was closer than they would have been. A pause. And I knew what it's like to wish someone would show up, and no one ever does. Lena didn't ask what. He meant the way he said it, flat, precise, with nothing ornamental, told her it wasn't something he said often. A soft knock on the door broke the moment. Sophie peeked in, holding a small stuffed bear under her arm, her hair still messy from sleep. When she saw her mother sitting upright, she ran in, arms flung wide. Mama. Alina pulled her into a hug. Hey baby, I'm okay. I'm okay now. Sophie looked at Damen, then back at her mom. He came fast, just like in movies. His car was shiny and loud. Alina managed to laugh. She looked up at the man. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Damien, he said. Simply, Damien Ward. The name made her blink. She heard it before somewhere. But before she could place it, a nurse stepped in, clipboard in hand. Miss Alina, your vitals look good. Can discharge you within the hour, but we'll need someone to sign the papers. Alina turned to Damien, surprised. You didn't have to stay. I know, he replied, but I did. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper. Discharge is done, and your bill is covered. Alina froze. What? I signed as a responsible party? It's done. I can't. You don't have to. Just take your daughter home. Sophie tilted her head. Is he your friend now, Mama? Alina looked at the man. In the coat, the calm face that had seen her at her most vulnerable and said nothing judgmental, just acted. Then she looked at Sophie and said softly, he might be.
Us.
The nurse helped her out of the bed. Alina turned once more to Damien. Thank you, not just for tonight, for staying. He nodded once, then turned to leave without another word. But just before he stepped out the door, he paused. Alina, right? She looked up. The hospital you used to work for was at St. Marin's? She blinked. Yes. Why? No reason, he said. Just sounded familiar. And then he was gone. But the weight of his presence still lingered like a door that hadn't quite closed. The cab dropped them off just before sunrise. Frost clung to the edge of the windows as Alina unlocked the apartment door, her hand trembling slightly from fatigue more than cold. Sophie's fingers were looped through hers, silent but close. The moment they stepped inside, the smell hit her, metallic, faint but sharp. She paused at the kitchen doorway. The puddle had dried into a dark smear across the linoleum. Lay tipped over against the counter, untouched since the night she collapsed. Lena moved quickly, ushering Sophie to the bedroom. Get changed, honey. I'll make something warm. As soon as the door clicked behind her daughter, Alina dropped to her knees with a damp rag and began scrubbing. Each motion was quiet and focused. She didn't cry. She didn't think. Halfway through rinsing the cloth, a knock came, and at a light tap. 3 solid, deliberate raps. She froze. Few people knocked on their door. Orion would have called. Landlord wouldn't bother this early. When she opened the door, Daman stood there. No coat this time. Just a sweater under a blazer and a paper bag in his hand. I brought some. Basic supplies, he said. Antiseptics. Gauze. I didn't know what the hospital gave you. Alina blinked, caught off guard by his presence more than the gesture. You didn't have to. I didn't do it for thanks, he said simply. May I come in? Sophie peeked out from the bedroom, her smile quick and bright. Hi, Mr. Damien. Alina hesitated. Only a second, then stepped aside. He walked in, placed the bag on the counter, and took a slow look around the small apartment. His eyes paused briefly on the kitchen floor, then returned to hers. I meant what I said. Your daughter did something most adults wouldn't do in that moment. Lena leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She's strong. Has to be. A beat of silence. Passed. Then Damien spoke again, his voice quieter this time. St. Mary's, that was your last job, right? She nodded. I was head nurse on the oncology floor for 8 years. You left voluntarily? No, she said, her jaw tightened. I filed a formal complaint after a patient died, an equipment error no one wanted to admit to. The finance board said it was an isolated issue. They shut me out before I could push further. Doman's eyes narrowed slightly. Nature of the malfunction? Her breath caught. Cardiac monitor failed during accumulated complication. The alert never sounded. We caught it too late. He said nothing for a moment, then asked, You still have documentation? Elena studied him. Why do you care? 'Cause that hospital receives funding from a foundation I once sat on. He replied, and the name St. Marin has come up in more than one irregularity report over the past 2 years. I never looked into it until now. There was a shift in her face, something between disbelief and recognition. Damien continued calmly. But clearly, if there's anything you kept, anything official, I'd like to see it. Off the record. She hesitated, then turned, walked to a side drawer near the fridge, and pulled out a brown envelope taped shut and labeled in her handwriting. Kana, 928th report. She handed it to him. I was going to submit it to the state medical board, she said, but by then I was already being pushed out. HR accused me of falsifying records. It never made it past legal review. Daman took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside were incident logs, screenshots of internal emails, and one printout circled in red. A delivery receipt for defective monitors signed by the hospital's CFO. He read the name, then looked up this signature. You saw it personally? No, she said, but the CFO signed off the supply orders for our floor. I assumed he'd have known. Daman folded the file closed. I know that name, he said. He worked on 2 of my early wellness centers. Both went over budget. Both shut down in under a year? He didn't explain more. He didn't have to. Then gently he handed the file back. Do you trust me enough to keep this for now? Elena's gaze was firm. I don't trust easily, but I trust facts. If you can do something with it, quietly, then keep. Sophie reappeared, now in a mismatched outfit and holding a stuffed panda under one arm. She looked up at her mother, then at Damien. Can he stay for pancakes? Elena let out the smallest laugh, the tension loosening just a fraction in her shoulders. Maybe next time, she said. He has important work. Daman gave Sophie a rare half-smile. Next time sounds good. He turned to Alina, a subtle seriousness returning. Someone buried this. Someone with reach. If I find anything, I'll let you know. But if you remember more, call me directly. He handed her a black card. No logo, just a number. And then he was gone. This time the door closed all the way. But what lingered behind wasn't silence. It was something new. Movement, momentum, a spark, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Damien didn't go home that night. He sat in his office overlooking the frozen river, the city lights casting a cold reflection across the glass. His coat was still on. The file Alina had handed him earlier lay open across his desk, each page lined with careful annotations, time-stamped records, and signatures that didn't quite match. At 2 a.m., the building was silent. Only the low hum of the server room and the occasional creak of metal from the heating vents kept him company. But Damon's mind was far louder. He wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or investor calls. He wasn't thinking about his tech empire, or the board's demands for a strategic rebrand. He was thinking about Alina and the way her hands shook slightly when she passed him the folder. But her eyes stayed steady. It's a kind of steadiness that comes from being ignored too long to waste. Time begging for belief. He reached for his phone and dialed a private line. "One ring. It's Jonas," he said as soon as it connected. "I need a complete audit of the Westwood Medical Fund. Full grant history, including subcontractors tonight." The man on the other end didn't argue. He knew the tone. "I'll start pulling it now." Damien hung up and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't slept since the night of the call. And even before that, he hadn't really rested in months. Years, maybe. A beep flashed on his screen. Internal investigation. CFO Westwood Health Initiative. He clicked it open. The name stared back at him. Andrew Kalin. That name had surfaced once before. Kalin had been the CFO on 3 separate wellness projects. Damon had invested in back in 2018, 2 mobile health clinics and a rural diagnostics pilot. All 3 had failed within 18 months. Budgets ballooned. Outcomes vanished, he'd written. Them off as market inefficiencies. But the name wasn't coincidence anymore. Not now. Another message came through. Unusual payouts flagged February 2021. $480,000. Redirected to subsidiary registered under Medcore Integrated Holdings LLC. Damien clicked on the corporate profile. Silent partner listed as a Kalon. He closed the screen. Stood. This wasn't just a matter of negligence. This was systemic, deliberate, and someone had been paying to keep it quiet. He picked up the phone again. This time, he didn't call a lawyer. He called her. The line buzzed once, twice. Then Elena's voice came through groggy. "Hello, it's me," Damon said, his voice low but steady. "I know it's late. I wouldn't have called unless it was important." There was a pause on the other end. She didn't sound startled, only quiet. "I'm listening," she said. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened the night of the monitor failure." Damien said, "Not the report, not the file, the real thing, the sequence, the conversations, what you saw, what you felt. I needed Alina. I need you to walk me through it like it's happening again." Silence stretched out between them. "Then there was a boy," she said. "Connor, 7 years old, leukemia. His counts were low, and the chemo had been hard on his heart. I told them we needed round-clock telemetry, not just Pulox." She took a breath, but the telemetry unit they gave us, Unit for C, had already flagged malfunctions. The week before, I reported it. Nothing changed. Damon closed his eyes. Then what? Night shift. I was covering for another nurse. Connor went into cardiac distress just after 2 a.m. The alert never sounded. We found him when his mother ran out into the hallway screaming. He coded before we got him back to ICU, died 40 minutes later. She paused, then added quieter. "They told me it was a fluke, but I saw the logs. The monitor never registered, and the device report had been altered by the time I accessed it again." Damon felt something in his chest tighten. "This wasn't about money for you," he said. "No," she replied. "It was about that mother, about the look on her face when I told her there. There was nothing else we could do. That face has never left me." Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Damon said, "Thank you. I believe you. I'll do the rest." "I don't want revenge," she said gently. "I want it to stop happening." He nodded, though she couldn't see him. "So do." Before he hung up, she said something that caught him off guard. "I didn't expect someone to follow up on that file, especially not you." Damon's voice was quiet. "Neither did I." He ended the call and leaned over the desk once more. The city outside remained asleep, but something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Damien didn't feel like he was circling the same stories, the same scandals, the same cleanup jobs masked as philanthropy. This was different. This mattered, and he wasn't going to stop. The boardroom at the 47th floor of Lucent Corps' Midtown Tower had never seen Damon Ward in silence for this long. The man who once rewired half the East Coast's emergency networks with a single strategic pitch was now leaning forward in his chair. Not speaking, he stared at the beige folder lying between him and Charles Whitmore, a seasoned board member and co-founder of one of the early venture groups that had believed in Damien a decade ago. Charles adjusted his reading glasses, flipping through the printed sheets Damon had brought without a word. "These aren't public records," he said quietly. "No," Damon replied, voice flat. Charles kept reading. Names, timestamps, transfer logs, screenshots of internal dashboards from the hospital's funding allocations. At the end of the packet was a single-page letter, unsigned, dated 7 years ago, written by a nurse who had refused to look away from a fatal monitoring error. Lena, Charles read the name aloud. "You've been thorough." "She didn't send the letter," Damon replied. "She kept it hidden until 2 nights ago." Charles didn't lift his eyes. "What does she want?" "Nothing," Damon said. "That's why I'm here." A long silence passed. In the distance, the Manhattan skyline throbbed in its usual rhythm, unaware that somewhere, in this room, the walls of a major health fund might be shaking. Charles finally spoke. "Damon, if even half of this is true, we're not talking about a compliance error. We're talking about criminal concealment funds misappropriated during patient fatality investigations. The CFO signed these?" Damien nodded once. "Publicity like this, it won't just damage Lucent's image. It could tank every joint initiative connected to that fund, lawsuits, class actions." Charles leaned back.
"Hey, then what are you doing?"
"I want the truth to be acknowledged internally. I want that man removed and the records audited. No fanfare, no press conference, justice." Quietly, Charles studied Damon's face. For a moment, he seemed to see not the sharp executive Lucent stockholders feared and admired, but the version of him that had disappeared from the headlines 2 years ago, after the disastrous AI pilot rollout that cost lives, reputation, and nearly his sanity. "You want to protect the nurse?" Charles said. "I want to protect what's left of decency in this system," Damien replied. And his voice had no tremble, no fire, just a low, steady determination. "She spoke up once and lost everything. I won't let that happen again." Charles closed the folder and slid it back across the table. He tapped 2 fingers on the cover.
Ow.
"Start with the audit committee, but this stays off the books until we get clean verification from legal. If this leaks, it won't." Damon cut in. "I've already spoken with Catherine from compliance. She's standing by with redacted backups. No digital trail." Charles let out a breath. "God, you really don't sleep, do you?" Damon offered a dry smile. "Not when good people bleed in the shadows." Outside, the city lights flickered against the clouds. Damien stood up, shook Charles's hand once, and left without another word. That night in his apartment, he sat on the floor with the folder open again. He didn't look at the numbers. He looked at the letter, at the hesitant handwriting of a woman who had once believed in a system that never protected her. He thought, if Sophie hadn't called the wrong number, none of this would have surfaced. He didn't believe in fate, but he believed in small chances. This time he wouldn't waste one. The knock came just after 9. Alina opened the door to find Damien standing there, coat still unbuttoned, eyes shadowed with something heavier than exhaustion. She stepped aside without a word. Sophie was already in bed, the soft hum of her nightlight buzzing faintly from the next room. In the kitchen, Helena poured 2 cups of tea and slid one across the table. "You found something, didn't you?" Damon nodded, placing a folder on the table. This one thinner than before, but somehow heavier. "Alina," he said, voice low,
"I want
"you to come back with me. Not to St. Maron, not as a nurse. I want you as a temporary, independent advisor. You're the only one who knows the inside of that system and isn't tainted by it." Alina didn't move. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. "No." Daman blinked. I haven't even explained. I don't need you to. She cut him off. I lived it. I remember. Every hallway, every emergency shift, every name they erased. You think I don't want justice? I do. But I also want to protect what's left of me. A silence spread between them like a crack forming in glass. Daman's voice softened. I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe you were the only one who could hold the truth together. That's not fair, she whispered. You want me to walk back into the place that broke me? Into the system that rewarded silence? Do you know what it takes to get out of that and stay sane? Daman didn't answer. It was Sophie's voice that broke the silence. From the hallway, small and unsure. Mom Elena turned. She'd be asleep. But Sophie stepped forward, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes flicked to Damien, then back to her mother. If you help them, will the bad people stop hurting others? Lena's breath caught in her chest. She looked at her daughter, the reason she'd stayed quiet all these years.
Thrice.
The reason she'd wanted a simple life away from headlines and meetings and moral compromises. Then she looked at Damien, waiting, not pushing. She closed her eyes and exhaled. All right, I'll do it. Damien didn't move. But I have one condition, she said, standing straighter. I don't do this for you. I don't do it for your company or your board. I do it for the patients who never got a second chance. And when this is over, I walk away. Damien nodded. All I hoped for. Later that night, in his car, Daman called Jonas. She's in, he said. Jonas didn't celebrate. Then I hope she's ready. Cord, because what I just pulled from Medcor's old shell accounts links them back to a second facility, a rural palliative center in Vermont.
Yes, you signed off on the transfer approval. Damien's grip on the steering.
Wheel tightened. Andrew Cowan. Exactly. Jonas said. We're not just looking at embezzlement. We're looking at patient neglect for profit. Daman didn't speak for a long moment, then start building the map. Trace every connection, but keep Elena's name out of every report. It's already done. In the apartment upstairs, Elena sat at the dining table long after Damien left. The folder lay unopened in front of her. Her tea had gone cold. She reached into the kitchen drawer, pulled out her old hospital ID and stared at it down, and reached instead for the red spiral notebook she kept beneath Sophie's coloring books. The one with notes, charts, initials, everything she'd once thought she'd burn. She opened to the first page and started rewriting history, this time with no intention of hiding it. The sun had barely risen when Jonas stepped into the private office on the 12th floor, file pressed to his chest, and a weariness in his eyes that spoke of too many hours combing through digital dust. Damien stood at the window, watching the street below, silent. He didn't turn around. You should see this, Jonas said, placing the folder on the glass table between them. It's the break we needed. Inside, stapled between pages of ledger exports and audit trails, was a scanned PDF. Transfer authorization from St. Marin Hospital dated December 17, 2021. Signed. Lena stamped approved by CFO Andrew Cowan. The problem was, Lena had never worked the finance department and she never signed off on anything beyond medical purchases. She certainly hadn't been on duty the night that form was time-stamped. Daman's hand clenched around the folder. She told me she never touched anything like this. She didn't, Jonah said. I had her signature from an old HR file. The loops are wrong. The baseline's too steady. It was forged. A long pause filled the room. Then Damien spoke, voice low and sharp. Send it now today. He picked up the phone not to call legal but to call Elena. Her voice was calm. I'll meet you at the apartment. I want to see it myself. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and old radiator heat. Sophie was at school. The silence unusually thick. Daman laid the document on the kitchen table. Elena read it slowly. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her hands didn't shake. She only blinked once, and that was when she saw her own name forged in tight, unnatural loops. I don't remember anything about that night, she said quietly. But I know I didn't sign this. I know, Damien replied. He paused. Watching her, I should have known they'd use your name. You were already discredited. No one would question it. That was the point, she said. Use someone broken. No one listens to the ones who've already fallen. Alina stood up, her chair scraping softly against the old tile floor. She moved to the sink, ran cold water over her hands. Her voice came back steadier. If we send this, Andrew is not going to go quietly. He won't get the chance, Damien said. The board is already preparing an emergency vote. We'll submit the full report before noon. A formal audit will follow, but once this signature goes public, he's finished. Alina dried her hands, turned back to him. Then let me be the one too. Send it. Damien looked at her, eyes searching. You sure? I need to end this. For every patient who trusted me, for every shift I covered while someone else patted their pockets, he nodded once. I'll be right here. She clicked send. 41 hours later, a notice was posted inside the executive channel of the Westwood board. Andrew Kalin suspended indefinitely, pending internal and federal investigation. The boardroom was unusually quiet that morning. It had been 48 hours since the Andrew suspension. The internal investigation moved quickly once the forged documents surfaced, and Jonas confirmed the MedCourt trail through multiple shell accounts. One by one, the pieces fell into place. Neat, damning, indisputable. And yet Helena stood by. The window of Damien's office, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't ask for results. Didn't ask if the man who tried to bury the truth was going to prison. She only asked one thing when Damien showed her the final report. Are the machines still being used? Damien shook his head. They were pulled 2 days ago. Every single unit flagged. You did that. Her shoulders dropped slightly, but her face didn't soften. Instead, she turned to him and said quietly, Then I'm done. Damien blinked. You mean I'm not going back to hospitals? Not to boards? Not to? Policies. Not to compliance meetings. I gave too much of myself to systems that swallowed people whole. I won't do it again. Damien took a breath, nodded. I understand. But he didn't stop there. I want you to stay on as an independent auditor. Flexible schedule, full benefits, triple what you made before. Lena didn't even hesitate. No, Damien raised an eyebrow. It's not charity, it's what you're worth. She looked up at him then, her gaze steady and sharp. Exactly, that's why I get to choose what peace looks like for me. A long pause. He didn't argue. Outside the glass wall behind them, the city buzzed as usual. Rain tapped softly against the pavement, barely audible above the low hum of city lights. It was Thursday, late, the kind of night most people stayed in, curled under blankets, waiting for tomorrow. But Damien wasn't most people. He stood outside the same old apartment building, a single bag of takeout in one hand, the other empty. He looked up. Second floor, third window from the left. The light was on. He didn't knock immediately. He stood there just breathing. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, faint jasmine from somewhere nearby. Then the door creaked open. Sophie stood there wrapped in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, grinning. You're late, she whispered. I know, Damien said, stepping inside. In. The small kitchen, warm light pulled over warm countertops. Alina stood barefoot, stirring something on the stove, hair tied back, no makeup. She turned, saw him. Their eyes met. No dramatic music, no sweeping monologues, just silence. The kind that meant something had shifted, not just in the room, but in them. Damien spoke first. I didn't come to change your life. Lena nodded once. I came because I think I need mine to be changed. Her breath hitched. I don't know what this is, he added quietly. But if you're still willing, I'd like to stay a little longer this time. She didn't rush to reply. Instead, she reached into the drawer, pulled out a second spoon, and handed it to him. Then stirred this. Don't let it burn. He laughed, surprised by the simplicity of it. No grand declarations, no neat endings, just a beginning. Sophie giggled from the table, flipping pages of her book. Damien stirred the pot, standing beside Alina, the scent of garlic and thyme rising between them. A life rebuilding itself in the smallest ways. In that moment, Damien understood what he had never been able to buy, build, or control. Belonging. Not as a savior, not as a CEO, just someone invited to stay. In a modest apartment with rain softening against the glass. A man who once had. Everything finally had something real. place at the table, a place to begin again, and two people willing to begin with him. The rain had not yet left the city, though it had softened into something gentler. The streets, still glistening from the night's downpour, carried a sheen that mirrored the muted glow of the street lamps. Puddles collected at uneven edges of the pavement, their surfaces broken occasionally by falling droplets, remnants of clouds reluctant to part with their burden. For Damien, the storm's passing was more than just a change in weather. It was a metaphor he had not asked for, but found himself living in. Once, storms had meant inconvenience, late drivers, stock markets unsettled by power outages, quarterly calls disrupted by travel delays. Now, rain meant something else entirely, a cleansing. He stood by the small kitchen window, his shoulders loose in a way they had never been in all the years of climbing corporate ladders. Behind him, Lena stirred something slowly on the stove, her hair tied back in a loose knot, wisps falling across her face in a way that made her look more real than any immaculate presentation he had ever witnessed in a boardroom. On the fridge door, Sophie's drawings clung stubbornly. Crayon houses, suns that took up half the page, smiling stick figures holding hands. A universe built in color, taped over a chipped surface that buzzed faintly when the motor kicked. The chipped mugs on the counter bore no logos, no polished branding. One had a faint crack running from rim to base, filled with years of use. Another bore fading letters of some long-forgotten holiday destination. Damien picked one up absent-mindedly, his thumb tracing the ridge where porcelain had worn smooth. He could not remember the last time he had held something imperfect and felt no urge to replace it. Once. His mornings had started with hand-pressed suits and stainless steel elevators that rose in silence 40 floors up. His coffee had been served in immaculate china cups or carried in branded takeaway containers by assistants whose names blurred in his memory. Every object had been curated, optimized, perfected, and yet not one of those mornings had made him feel like this chipped mug did. Oddly grounded, oddly human. Alina hummed under her breath, not even realizing she was doing it. The melody was simple, perhaps a half-forgotten tune from childhood, or maybe something she had heard on the radio earlier. But to Damien, it was extraordinary. In boardrooms, silence had always been deliberate, weighted, sharp, a weapon. Here, sound was unintentional, unguarded, soft. Peace. He rolled the word across his mind, almost suspicious of it. Peace had never been something he trusted. For years he had considered it synonymous with complacency. Peace was what people clung to when they lacked ambition, when they had no desire to push further, higher, faster. He had treated it as an obstacle to be dismantled, a myth that slowed those unwilling to fight. But now, standing barefoot on cool kitchen tiles, his shirt clinging slightly where rain had seeped in earlier, he began to wonder if peace was something else entirely. Perhaps it was not the absence of striving, but the presence of something subtler, belonging. Sophie padded into the kitchen, her small footsteps quick hair mussed from where she had been curled on the couch. She carried with her a coloring, pencil green, clutched tightly in one hand. Without hesitation, she walked past him and tugged at Elena's cardigan, asking some question he did not catch. Elena leaned down, answered softly, and returned to stirring. Sophie nodded and climbed onto a chair, legs swinging, pencil still in hand. Damien watched the scene unfold with a peculiar ache in his chest. It was not pain exactly, but recognition. The kind of recognition that made him realize how alien this had been to him for so long. He had stood before crowds of shareholders, commanded teams of hundreds, controlled budgets larger than entire towns. Yet he had never stood in a room that felt more complete than this one. With its humming fridge and its chipped mugs, and its small girl drawing suns on scraps of paper. He thought of his old office, polished walnut desk, endless glass walls, city skyline stretching like a trophy cabinet outside his window. Everything had gleamed. Everything had been curated to impress. But not once had that space made him feel like he belonged. It had tolerated him, celebrated him even, but never embraced him. Belonging, he realized, was not about titles or wealth. It was about being seen without performance. Lena had not asked him about market share or strategy or what deals he was pursuing. Sophie did not look at him with expectation. Here, he was simply a man, damp from rain, holding a cracked mug, unsure of what came next. And it was enough. His mind, conditioned by decades of measurement and comparison, tried to quantify this feeling. Was it freedom? Security? Perhaps. Contentment? Yet none of those words fit neatly. It was something quieter, humbler. Belonging in simplicity. He glanced again at Sophie's drawings. Crayon suns. Houses with doors too large for their frames. Figures with oversized smiles. They were crude, imperfect, utterly human, and they were priceless. No framed award, no stock ticker, no press clipping could compete with their stubborn presence on that fridge door. Alina, still humming, slid a plate onto the counter, its edge chipped just like the mug's. She wiped her hands absently on her cardigan and caught his gaze for a moment, not long enough to make it deliberate, just long enough to say, "You are here, and that is enough." Damien exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding. His shoulders softened further. His mind, used to racing through contingencies and calculations, slowed. For once, he was not anticipating the next move. He was not rehearsing answers to questions not yet asked. He was simply standing in a kitchen. With rain still dripping outside, watching two people live unselfconsciously, he thought of the phrase he had once used in countless interviews, work-life balance. How hollow it sounded now, as if life could be something balanced against work. As if the two were weights on a scale instead of one vast current dragging everything along. Work had consumed him. Life had become something he purchased in fragments. Vacations measured in days, dinners cut short by calls, birthdays interrupted by crises. Balance had never existed. Only absence and presence. And too often, he had chosen absence. But here, with Alina humming and Sophie coloring and chipped mugs waiting to be filled, he felt present in a way he never had before. The storm had passed, and the city outside would return to its usual chaos soon enough. But inside this small apartment, there was a different kind of order, uncurated, imperfect, alive. Damien's gaze lingered on the chipped mug in his hand. Once, he would have replaced it without thought. Now, he realized, it was perfect as it was. Not because of its flaw, not despite it, but because of what it represented. Use, history, belonging. The kind of belonging he had chased across continents. Boardrooms and balance sheets, only to find it here. In the quiet after the storm, and for the first time in years, he wondered if peace was not something to fight against, but something to choose. Sophie's world was small, but it was hers, stretched from the corner of the living room, where her crayons lived in a dented tin box, to the window seat in the hallway where she liked to curl up with books, to the little strip of sidewalk. Outside the apartment where she chalked flowers that never wilted, her world was not made of marble halls or high-rise towers. It was built of tape marks on the carpet, paper stars hung crooked from the ceiling, and bedtime stories that carried her safely into sleep. She noticed things adults often missed. The way Damien stood a little too still sometimes, as though waiting for an invisible signal. The way he looked at the fridge drawings, not quickly like most grown-ups, but long enough that she thought maybe he was trying to learn something from them. The way his shoulders eased when Alina hummed while cooking. Sophie noticed it all, the way children do, without agenda, without words for it. But with a quiet knowing, at first, Damien had seemed like a visitor, someone who belonged to another world. He wore clothes that didn't quite match the softness of their home, and his eyes carried too much thinking behind them. Sophie had been cautious, not because she was afraid, but because she knew that visitors often left. She had learned not to tie her laughter too tightly to anyone who might disappear. But Damien did something unexpected. He stayed, not only through the rain, but into the quiet days after. He did not hover, but neither did he retreat into the background. He occupied the space with a kind of uncertainty that made Sophie curious. He wasn't like the neighbors who swept in with confident chatter, or like Elena's friends who came with stories and then left quickly. Damien seemed unfinished somehow. Sophie recognized that because she, too, felt unfinished in ways children can't name but live through every day. One evening, she brought her schoolwork to the table. Multiplication, neat rows of numbers, the kind of thing that usually bored her. Damien was nearby, his hand around a mug, eyes distracted as if he was thinking about something far away. She tapped the page with her pencil. "Do you know how to do these?" she asked. He blinked, then leaned closer. Numbers? For a man who had once juggled markets and mergers, they should have been easy, and they were, in theory. But the numbers here were different. They weren't tied to profit or loss, but to Sophie's expectant face. He explained slowly, drawing little boxes and grouping them into sets. Sophie frowned, considered, and then laughed when his box shapes turned wobbly. "You draw like a kindergartner," she teased. He grinned, caught off guard by the way her teasing warmed him instead of stinging. "And yet," he replied, "the math still works." From then on, homework became less of a task and more of a ritual. Sophie would test how much he remembered, deliberately asking things she half knew already. Damien would struggle out loud, and together they turned each answer into a kind of joke. She would clap dramatically if he got it right, and shake her head like a teacher when he did, one afternoon. Sophie asked if he knew how to braid hair. Damien froze. "No," he admitted honestly. She grinned mischievously, handed him one of her dolls, and said, "Try." The result was a tangled disaster, strands sticking out at odd angles. But Sophie laughed so hard she fell sideways onto the couch. "You'd never survive in my classroom," she declared. "Good thing I'm not applying," he shot back, pretending to defend his crooked braid. But inside, the moment stirred something deeper. He had faced hostile investors, impossible deadlines, and journalists digging for weakness, but never had failure felt so harmless. Sophie's laughter had turned his clumsiness into connection. In the quiet days that followed, Sophie began to weave him into her small world. She would share facts from her books, how dolphins sleep with one eye open, how ants can carry many times their weight. She recited these with the gravity of a professor, watching closely to see if he was listening. He always was. Unlike many adults, Damien never brushed her off. He nodded, asked questions, and even admitted when he didn't know something. That, more than anything, earned her trust. One night while Elena washed dishes, Sophie pulled a chair close to Damien and whispered, "Do you ever get scared?" The question startled him. "Sometimes," he said carefully. "What of?" She pressed, eyes wide. He thought of markets collapsing, reputations unraveling, betrayals hidden behind smiles. But he also thought of losing this fragile belonging. He didn't say all of that, not in words a child would hold. Instead, he said, "I'm scared of forgetting what matters." Sophie considered this and nodded as though she understood more than he expected. Then she whispered, "Me too." And just like that, the gap between them narrowed. Sophie, without meaning to, became the bridge Damien hadn't known he needed. Her innocence was not naive, but resilient. She carried small scars of her own, moments of disappointment, lessons in absence, yet she still laughed freely, still believed in tomorrow's possibilities. In her company, Damien began to see a different measure of strength. It wasn't in how much one could control, but in how much one could hold without closing off. Sophie held joy and curiosity, sadness and questions, and she never pretended to be other than she was. She became, in his mind, proof that resilience could be quiet, playful, even mischievous. They developed inside jokes about his terrible braiding skills, about how he always burned toast, about the way Sophie insisted that her stuffed bear had opinions on everything. These jokes became threads, stitching them together in ways words never fully captured. Sometimes, when Sophie read aloud from her books, Damien would watch her lips move and marvel at how earnestly she gave life to each sentence. He thought of his own speeches, polished and rehearsed, delivered to win favor or secure deals. They had been performances. Sophie's words, stumbling at times, were real. She wasn't performing, she was living. One afternoon she asked him to draw with her. He hesitated, unused to crayons, but sat beside her anyway. His drawing was clumsy, a sun that looked more like an egg, a tree with lopsided branches. Sophie looked at it and giggled. "It's perfect," she declared, and then added her own details, weaving his crooked sun into her bright, sprawling landscape. In that moment, Damien realized that peace was not about perfection, but about being accepted even when imperfect. The bond grew not in grand gestures, but in these tiny, ordinary acts. Helping with homework, sharing laughter over burnt toast, sitting side by side with crayons. Each moment carried its own weight, subtle yet undeniable. Sophie's world had expanded to include him, and in doing so, his world had narrowed into something truer. She was not simply a child he happened to share space with. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting back into the emptiness of titles and power. Through her, he saw a different kind of future, not one measured in quarterly reports or social prestige, but in the possibility of belonging that could not be bought or traded. And though she did not know it, Sophie had given Damien the one thing he had never managed to claim in all his years of striving: the courage to be ordinary. Alina had always known how to carry weight quietly. The world expected women like her to bend or break under pressure, but she had long ago learned the art of appearing softer than she was. That oversized cardigan she wore, 2 sizes too big, its sleeves rolling over her wrists, was more than comfort. It was armor, a shield against a world that often demanded too much, too fast, and gave too little in return. People thought strength came in loud gestures, declarations, defenses, confrontations. For Alina, it came in quiet choices. The choice to get up each morning and make breakfast even when exhaustion clung to her bones. The choice to hum while stirring food, to create a rhythm of calm for Sophie, though her mind often swirled with worries she never voiced. The cardigan wrapped around her was a reminder that she did not owe the world's sharp edges to prove her resilience. She had survived enough to know that gentleness could be a fortress. When Damien appeared in their lives, she had felt the old walls rising instinctively. She could not afford carelessness. Men who seemed steady often drifted away when life became less convenient. Promises, she had learned, were lighter than paper. She had lived through absence, through the stretch of days where her only anchor was the small girl drawing suns with crayons. Trust had become something measured, rationed out slowly like sugar in lean times. And yet, there he was, lingering in her kitchen, holding cracked mugs, listening not out of courtesy, but out of some deeper need. She noticed how he paused at Sophie's drawings, how he looked at the chipped plates as though they carried history instead of shame. These small observations unsettled her more than any grand gesture could have. A man who valued the ordinary might prove harder to shut out. Her fears were not dramatic, but they were steady. What if he left after Sophie grew attached? What if his silence one day hardened into distance? What if this warmth was temporary, like weather that teased with sunlight before plunging back into cold? Lena had built her life around surviving. Such winters, she could not risk Sophie's heart on a season that might pass. But survival, she reminded herself, was not the same as living. She had survived alone. She had raised Sophie on chipped mugs and secondhand furniture. She had held herself steady when the nights were long and the bills were unforgiving. That kind of endurance was its own form of courage, but it was not the whole of life. To let someone in to allow Damien to stay required a different kind of bravery. Alina did not fall in love with fireworks. She had no appetite for the reckless blaze of passion that consumed everything in its path. What she valued were gestures that lasted, the patience to sit through Sophie's questions, the willingness to try and fail at something as simple as braiding hair, the humility to laugh at his own mistakes. Those were the tests she trusted. One evening, she invited him to help in the kitchen. It was not a dramatic invitation, not accompanied by soft music or heavy glances. It was simple. She handed him an onion and a knife. He accepted with a seriousness that almost made her laugh. She watched as he tried to mimic her slicing, his pieces uneven, his pace awkward. At one point, he wiped his eyes dramatically from the sting, as she caught herself smiling despite the ache of caution still sitting in her chest. Too fast. She corrected gently, moving his hand to show him the rhythm. Cooking isn't about racing. He nodded, tried again, and failed again. The pile of lopsided onion pieces grew, and Sophie, sitting nearby, laughed at his effort. Alina didn't stop her. Laughter, she knew, was part of the learning. And Damien, to his credit, didn't bristle at failure. He laughed too, shaking his head and promising he'd master it eventually. It was in these moments that Alina saw love in practice. Not in declarations, but in the willingness to stand in the small space of their kitchen and fail at chopping onions. Not in grand promises, but in the way he leaned into her instructions, trusting her expertise as though it mattered more than all his boardroom strategies. Over time, she began to teach him recipes from her family. Dishes that carried not just flavor, but memory, the way her mother used to sprinkle herbs without measuring, the way her grandmother insisted that soup had to be stirred clockwise. Damien listened with respect, repeating her instructions as, though memorizing scripture, his hands fumbled, but his attention never wavered. For Alina, this was where trust took root. A man could pretend in conversation, could dress words in flattery, but he could not fake the patience it took to learn another's rituals. Each evening spent cooking became a kind of language between them, not dramatic, but steady, layered, with meaning. Sometimes she leaned against the counter when her shoulders grew heavy, and Damien would take over stirring, letting her rest for a few minutes. It was a small act, easily overlooked, but for Alina, it carried the weight of something larger, the permission to lean on someone else. She had not done that in years. She had always been the anchor, the one holding everything steady. To release even a fraction of that responsibility felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Her cardigan, that oversized, comforting shield, began to feel less like armor and more like habit. She realized one evening that she had taken it off without thinking, her sleeves rolled up as she worked beside him. The air touched her arms, and the gesture, though small, carried the quiet significance of someone beginning to lower their guard. At night, when Sophie was asleep, Alina sometimes sat in the living room and let herself remember the loneliness she had endured, the moments when she feared the silence would swallow her, the way she had fought to protect Sophie from every disappointment, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. Those memories did not vanish. They shaped her, marked her. But beside them now sat new images: Damien fumbling with onions, Sophie laughing at his uneven braids, the three of them sharing burnt toast as though it were a feast. Alina understood. That love was not about replacing the past, but about choosing what to carry forward. Her fears remained, but they no longer dictated her every choice. Her strength had always been survival. Now she was discovering another kind of strength, the courage to let survival grow into something gentler, more generous. She did not rush. She did not declare. But she chose in small increments to let Damien stay. And in those quiet choices, Alina revealed her truest power, the ability to rebuild, not with walls, but with doors carefully, cautiously opened. And though she never said it aloud, she knew this was how love practiced itself into permanence. The city had a way of holding its memories in glass and steel. For Damien, every reflective surface carried an echo of the man he had once been. Some mornings, when he walked Sophie to school or ran an errand for Alina, he would pass a building. That caught the light just so, and for a moment, he would see the old version of himself staring back, polished suit, measured stride, eyes too focused to notice anything beyond the next deadline. He tried not to linger on these reflections. But the past had its own way of insisting. One afternoon, the rain had lifted, and the sidewalks were crowded with professionals hurrying back from lunch breaks. Damien's route took him through the financial district, a part of town he had once known intimately. He hadn't planned it. It was simply the most direct way to the bookstore where Sophie's teacher had recommended a novel for her class. But the moment he turned the corner and the skyline revealed itself, he felt the familiar weight pressing down. There it was, his old office building. 50 stories of mirrored glass, its lobby perpetually bustling with men and women impressed. Suits, clutching leather briefcases, and coffees branded with the latest trends. Damien stopped across the street. The sight was like looking at a stage where he had once played the starring role. A memory, unspooled, unbidden. The penthouse suite at the top, his office carved out of sunlight and silence. Remembered the long table polished to a shine, the leather chairs that swallowed visitors whole, the smell of paper and ink and ambition. Nights when he had sat alone at his desk, the city glittering outside the window like a promise. Him. He remembered the applause at corporate dinners, the way his name was spoken with reverence, the weight of being both admired and envied. Yet what struck him most was not the power, but the loneliness threaded through it. Applause had always faded. Too quickly. Praise had often been currency, not care. He had been surrounded, yet solitary, trapped in rooms full of voices that never truly spoke to him. Damien shifted his weight on the sidewalk. Across the street, a familiar face emerged from the revolving doors. Jonathan Price, one of his old colleagues, maybe even a rival depending on the year. The man spotted him almost immediately, surprise flashing across his features. He raised a hand, smiling. Damien. Jonathan called, weaving through the crowd to reach him. Damien offered a polite nod. Jonathan. You've disappeared, Jonathan said with mock reproach, adjusting his tie. Rumor was you'd retired, gone off to some villa in Spain. Didn't expect to see you haunting the old neighborhood. Just passing through, Damien replied evenly. Jonathan laughed. Well, you're missed. Things aren't the same without you. The new leadership, let's just say, they don't command the same respect. You should drop by sometime, show them how it's done. Damien smiled faintly. But inside, something turned. He thought of Sophie's laughter when he burned toast, of Elena's voice instructing him on how to chop onions, of the chipped mug that had become his morning ritual. He thought of the warmth of belonging, the peace he had begun to let himself believe in. I don't think so, Damien said it. Last, Jonathan blinked, surprised. Really? All those years building this place? You don't even want to know? Damien interrupted gently, but firmly. I don't. The words startled even him with their clarity. There was no bitterness in them, no regret, only certainty. Jonathan studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Well, suit yourself. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find us. He adjusted his tie again, already glancing toward the building as though drawn back by gravity. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed into the revolving doors. Damien remained on the sidewalk a while longer, watching the glass tower loom above. Once, it had been his cathedral. He had worshipped at its altar of deals and deadlines. He had sacrificed time, relationships, his own sense of self for the illusion of permanence it promised. But now, standing apart, he saw it differently.
Ow.
The glass no longer gleamed with allure. It looked cold, impersonal, like a mirror reflecting nothing but emptiness. He turned away as he walked back through the city. Damien let the memories play out one last time. The penthouse suite, the corporate dinners, the clinking of glasses. Raised in his honor, the scripted laughter of colleagues. He did not flinch from them, nor did he crave them. They were simply echoes, remnants of a life he had chosen to leave. By the time he reached the bookstore, heaviness had lifted. He picked up the novel Sophie's teacher had recommended, ran his hand over the cover, and imagined reading the first chapter with her that evening. That thought warmed him more than any boardroom victory ever had. On his way home, Damien understood something with new clarity. Leaving that world had not been a loss. It was liberation. Liberation from applause that meant nothing, from power that cost too much, from a version of himself that had been hollowed out by endless striving. What he had now was smaller, humbler, but infinitely more alive, belonging in chipped mugs, laughter in homework sessions, quiet strength in Elena's presence. The echoes of his past no longer pulled at him. They only reminded him of the choice he had made and why he would never go back. The rain had returned by evening, not in torrents, but as a gentle drizzle tapping against the window. The three of them sat at the small table, plates half empty, Sophie's laughter filling the spaces between bites. She was telling a story about school, exaggerating wildly, her hands flailing as if the whole world depended on her reenactment. Damien listened, not with the half-smile he once wore in boardrooms, with real attention, his eyes alive in a way they hadn't been in years. Alina reached for her glass, her fingers brushing his. She didn't pull away. The contact was fleeting, but it was enough, an unspoken acknowledgement that he was no longer a visitor, but part of something that belonged to all of them. Damien glanced at the window, at the softened rain against the glass. Once storms had meant chaos, disruption, a threat to schedules and control. Now, rain meant continuity, life pulsing quietly around him. Washing the city clean in its own time, he had once lived at the top of towers, his name echoing in applause that never lasted. But here, in the warmth of this small apartment, with Sophie's giggles and Elena's quiet hand, he finally had something real.